Good morning. Welcome to another episode of Reason to Resist. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal, Quebec. I returned to Canada this past weekend from Greece, and today I'm very pleased to be joined by Professor Richard Sakwa. Richard is Professor Emeritus of Politics at the University of Kent at Canterbury, where he is today. He's a senior research fellow at HSC in Moscow and an honorary professor in the Faculty of Political Science at Moscow State University. After graduating in history from the LSE, he took a PhD from the Center for Russian and East European Studies at the University of Birmingham. He held lectureships at the Universities of Essex and California, Santa Cruz, before joining the University of Kent in 1987. Richard has published widely on Russian and international affairs. Recent books include Frontline Ukraine, Crisis in the Borderlands, and Russia Against the Rest, the Post-Cold War Crisis of World Order. His book, The Lost Peace: How We Failed to Prevent a New Cold War, was published in October of last year. Thank you for joining me today, Richard.
My pleasure.
So I'd like to start our discussion today, Richard, with the war in Ukraine. By my estimation, the Ukraine war has turned into a debacle of epic proportions for Western governments. They've poured hundreds of billions of dollars into this war. They've consistently adopted a maximalist position that Russia must withdraw from all parts of 1991 Ukraine, including Crimea, that it must pay reparations, and that Ukraine must be allowed to enter NATO. In other words, they've demanded what appears to be total surrender by the Russian Federation. But as many of us predicted, battlefield developments have made a mockery of those demands. And all along the front line, a tragedy for the Ukrainian people has unfolded. Its forces are now collapsing. I think it's fair to say the most recent in a long line of Ukrainian losses just happened in the eastern Ukrainian city of Selidova, which Russian forces appear to have captured completely. And to make matters worse, Western sanctions seem to have put Europe's leading economies in a far worse state than they have affected Russia. Somehow, some way, NATO, I think, will have to come to terms with its decisive defeat by Russia. How do you think the collapse of Project Ukraine will affect NATO and the current political order in Europe?
Yeah, there's a lot of things in there. The first thing I'd like to echo is what you just said, which is that the whole war is a tragedy of unparalleled level. Obviously, firstly, for the Ukrainian people, but also for the Russian people. And indeed, I would even give them as a subject of history, the European people, which so often in all of this, Europe is simply subsumed into the West. But, for Europe, and I'll come back to that, it's a tragedy. And so, especially since this war was eminently avoidable, and ultimately the way it's going to end will reflect the way that it could have been avoided in the first place, which is some sort of deal over, certainly, I think, non-negotiable is that Ukraine, what's left of it, does not join NATO, some neutrality, and all the rest. So you're absolutely right that it's been a tragedy. Second point is that, as you note, the developments on a battlefield have been, Russia usually starts a war, badly. I mean, it's just typical. It usually does. The First World War, of course, that even ended badly as well. The Second World War. And so many. Of course, it lost the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, 1905, which prompted a revolution, which is what many people hoped would happen this case. Instead of which, Russia has marshaled its forces, it's gathered its industrial potential, because despite the reforms of the 1990s, the neoliberalization, Russia remains a major full spectrum service economy. That is with heavy industry, steel making, all the way through to shipbuilding, plane making, and so on. Okay, we can say some of these elements are not the cutting edge of technological development, yet Russia is a full service economy. And I've been saying that for many, many years. Also with a highly educated population. And more than that, there is a high degree of political consolidation. And this has often been overlooked. Yes, we can condemn many, many aspects of life within Russia, but at the same time, overall, until 2020, certainly, it was a soft authoritarian system. It's become much harder, of course, since then, and in wartime conditions, even worse. But still, It's still opinion polls show that support for Putin still remains in the high 80s. Mostly, I mean, it's dipped below 70 at various points, but it's still very high, one way or another. Something that Western leaders would absolutely die for, that sort of level of popular support. So I don't anticipate at this point any internal revolution or coup or anything like that. Lots and lots of stresses and tensions. Obviously, I won't go into detail now. In the North Caucasus, as always, there's issues bubbling away: Chechnya, Ingushetia, North Ossetia just recently, etc. Third, the key thing is that there are new patterns in international politics emerging. You talked about the defeat of NATO, and it's something even bigger than that. What's war always, and this is in comparative politics, many studies have shown this. War leads to the state transformation. It changes a state. Charles Tilley talked about states make war, and war makes states. And this is never truer than today. What's happening today is that this war has really forged a new Russia out of this, whether we like it or not. It is a powerful military force with a network of alliances. We saw the recent BRICS summit, the 16th in Kazan, where 35 states attended, 6 international organizations, including the General Secretary of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. And of course, Xi Jinping attended in person. Other leaders attended there and refused to attend at the same time. For example, a South African leader, the Commonwealth Conference, which was taking place in Samoa. Just a little symbolic moment, as it were. So so if we don't know, Russia is advancing. Many people say, look, it's taken them 2.5 years just to get out from the Donbass. They're still, you mentioned, a slight advance, and they're moving towards Pokrovsk. Ugledar fell a few weeks ago, and so on. And of course, now, even this morning, I heard that Russia has surrounded 2,000 troops in the Kursk, the incursion which took place in August. So they won't last long there. So it's quite clearly Russia is advancing. And once they get beyond Pokrovsk, they then have effectively stepped all the way to the Dnieper River. So the reason for the slow advance is that this part where they've been fighting is highly populated, highly industrialized, with huge redoubts and mines and coking plants and so on, where the Ukrainians have dug in. And of course, they've expended their best forces. So one can anticipate they'll move faster. Yes. So does this mean the defeat of NATO and the collective West, the political West, as I call it? Yes, phenomenally so. How they can, obviously, they're trying to hang on until the US presidential election in early November, not far away now. And then what happens? Another type of Afghanistan retreat, another collapse, Vietnam style, who knows? But for my final point on this thing is that really, whether, I mean, you could argue, how did the loss of the Vietnam War really transform the United States? Okay, it was a bit more, but less interventionist for a few years, but then it came, blasting back not long afterwards in the 1980s. So will they learn? I wonder. And just one final point is, of course, one of the transformations which has actually taken place is the NATOization of the European Union. I've always been a passionate European, but not this Europe which is emerging today. A more functionalist one in which we have cultural and education and other links, economic, of course, mobility links, but not one which is effectively the European Union becoming an instrument for what some call the vassalization of the European states. Germany, France, Italy have lost their subjectivity in international politics because of NATO, because of the European Union, because of the NATOization of the European Union as well. So, there's occasionally they say, well, we need a negotiated end to the war. Scholz has said that a few times, Macron earlier, not now. Mm-hmm. Well, had no traction. Decisions are made in Washington.
Right. I must say, Richard, that precisely the same applies to Canada. Like, Canada has been NATO and completely rendered subservient, particularly from a foreign policy perspective, to Washington. But I'd like to shift the conversation to a different part of the border region of Russia, and that's Georgia, where in another sense, a non-military sense, I suppose, NATO and the West appear to have suffered another defeat. That was a defeat of an electoral nature. I'm talking about the result this weekend in the Georgian parliamentary election, in which the Georgian Dream Party received, according to official results, more than 54% of the vote. And this has caused, as I'm sure you know, Richard, deep consternation in Western halls of power, because the ruling party is viewed as having deepened ties with Russia and not is viewed by the West as not being sufficiently enthusiastic about Georgia's admission to the European Union. Now, as a citizen of Greece, I don't only have citizenship here in Canada, and I spend a lot of time in Greece and Europe. Frankly, I can't imagine why any sane country would want to join the EU at this stage. The EU not only destroyed the Greek economy with a severe and inhumane austerity program, but I believe it's become profoundly anti-democratic, and as you've indicated, extraordinarily subservient to Washington. But nonetheless, my question for you, Richard, is what do you make of Western accusations about the election in Georgia? People like U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken are all but alleging electoral fraud and Russian meddling in the Georgian election. Do you think this result is likely to reflect the true will of the Georgian people?
And also the president, Salome Zagabishvili, has also claimed electoral fraud, and she's called the people out onto the streets to protest against it, the victory of Georgian dream. Interestingly enough, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, is visiting, because Orban represents the other Europe, the one which wants peace, which considered the European Union a peace project, along with Robert Fico in Slovakia. So he's visiting Georgia as a sign of solidarity, the extreme one. And of course, the political West regards the fact that the Georgian people have spoken well. I mean, I'm sure there were cases of electoral fraud, ballot stuffing, and the like, that possibly, but I don't think that ultimately affected the overall result. And of course, they talk about opinion exit polls. And of course, the way that often this works now, I mean, obviously, we'd need deeper investigation, but I could suggest that, exit polls showed two things. Obviously, one side showed that they were going to win the Georgian Dream, and the UNM, the opposition grouping at the heart of the opposition, suggested the other. But I think it reflected the will of the Georgian people, who've shown a certain wisdom here, because I thought the governing it sponsored by Bidan Ivanishvili, who is the sponsor of since 2012, since Georgian Dream has been in power, basically saying, look what's happened to Ukraine. Do you want this to be repeated? Now, of course, the Western powers say this is scaremongering. It seems to me something to be genuinely scared about, because to be caught in the vice of geopolitical conflict like Ukraine is, to the suffering, which has been so catastrophic. Georgians wisely, I think, have avoided that. And of course, Georgia is not pro-Russian, not it's still directing, but it's not anti-Russian in a virulent form, which Ukraine had become. And that's a very important difference. Georgians are pro-Georgian. And that is, of course, how it should be. They're trying to defend their own national interests and national autonomy, as you say, from the way that many European Union states have basically become, unable genuinely to have an independent foreign policy. Georgia is still committed to joining the European Union. Of course, that's falling back, support for that move, because what would be the benefit? Of course, trade and so on, and human links, and they've got visa-free travel are very important. That's obviously important. But at the same time, so is autonomy in foreign policy and not becoming a cat's paw of the game of external powers. And that's, of course, exactly what the EU, NATO, and the United States wanted. So, I very much welcome this result and think that it gives the Georgians a chance to develop in their own way. Of course, another thing which has really annoyed the West is the fact that the Chinese are investing massively in the port, which they're building just north of Abkhazia. South, it'd be the other way, south of Abkhazia along the Black Sea coast. A major port, 50 billion tons capacity once it's finished. It's a really major step. In other words, and touching on our earlier question, is that we are emerging into a genuinely post-Western world. And I stress again, it shouldn't be anti-Western, because we're Western, and I certainly don't want anybody to be against us. But we want a better West and a post-West, which the world is moving on. The BRICS summit showed it, the Georgian election has showed it, elsewhere, the agenda, and in fact, the European Union and this old political West, forged by the first Cold War, then perpetuated and reproducing Cold War today, and indeed reproducing hot war in Europe today, is becoming an anachronism. And that is showing what a potential defeat in Ukraine and this electoral defeat in Georgia is showing.
This actually, your latter point, which is extremely important, Richard, brings me to the subject of another war, actually multiple wars happening and unfolding and escalating in West Asia, both the one in Ukraine and the wars in West Asia have potential existential implications for humanity, depending upon the degree of escalation. And in the Western so-called mainstream discourse, I personally want to stop calling it mainstream because it's in many respects from planet Mars, but be that as it may, these wars are generally discussed as though they're distinct phenomena. The one in Ukraine, from my perspective, is characterized as being a consequence of alleged Russian imperialism and expansionism, while the one in West Asia is generally characterized as being a consequence of some nefarious project on the part of Arab and Muslim extremists in the region to wipe out an allegedly democratic state that describes itself as the Jewish state. I've long argued on this program that both of these narratives are nonsense, and we can get into that in more detail if you like, but what I really want to focus on is the bigger picture. Do you believe that these two wars are, as presented, namely distinct phenomena with their own individual causes, or do you think that they're actually related and that the developments in one theater of conflict can have a significant influence on developments in the other theater of conflict? And if so, what do you think the nature of that relationship is?
Yeah, just the first thing you mentioned, the mainstream media, just if I may comment on that. You're absolutely right, because what's happened in the public discourse, or the battle of narratives, as we'd say in the West today, is that a certain vision of the world, this Cold War vision that we're trying to defend US primacy or dominance, without its hegemony, then the whole world would collapse into anarchy. Well, that's done a great job, hasn't it? So it's but the way that things have developed is that the way I've lately been thinking about this is that a certain vision of the world has become hyper-normalized in the post-Cold War years. It used to be challenged by socialists, by peaceniks, by church groups, by the Soviet Union, by a whole stack of others. The discourse is now, we still have pockets of resistance. Even now, this conversation today is symbolic of that. But this hyper-normalization, if you like, of a military industrialized, with the mainstream media is all part of that, the intelligence services, all of that, and therefore anything which fights against it is therefore considered abnormal, even evil, and to be, suppressed. To have this whole disinformation industry. And what is disinformation? I mean, sometimes it's misinformation and lies and propaganda, of course. But at the same time, this anti-disinformation industry is a way of suppressing this debate and narratives and the challenging this hyper-normalization internally. So that's, I think, that whole issue is fundamentally important. But returning to the main question about the connection between these various conflicts, absolutely. Each one, of course, has its own dynamics and its own roots and its own historical context, of course. But you're absolutely right that they're connected. And what is the connection? It's, in my view, I've been arguing, it's that there is this thing called the political West. This is a very interesting how can I put it, alignment of forces. And this is the United States and its claim, and it was dominant, of course. In 1945, the US represented 50% of global GDP. But of course, the world is changing. Multipolarity is a fact. China has emerged as a peer competitor to Russia in many ways as well. India, of course. Russia is now the world's fourth largest economy in purchasing terms. So that's not to be, clearly US dominance, as you say, the deindustrialization and the weakening of Europe as a separate force. But this political West effectively, obviously, provoked the war in Ukraine in all sorts of ways by refusing to recognize even the other Ukraine within Ukraine, which I've always talked about. In fact, today I had a long discussion with, and I won't give the name, obviously, for a very, very good scholar within Ukraine who's been fighting for many, many years against that totalizing vision of the Maidan revolution, which then excluded all options, which led to provoked Crimea, provoked Donbass, provoked this war, ultimately. So this, well, if you like, going back to the other point, I suppose, a hypernormal political West closed down options within Ukraine and options peaceful resolution, Minsk as well, the Minsk agreement. And it's at the same time, it failed to chain in the how can I put it, the extremist forces within Israel. With Netanyahu at his head and his endless manipulations, funding Hamas before October the 7th last year, and all the other manipulations which Netanyahu is an absolute master for. So, but they do have a connection, and it's clear that Western policy in West Asia has been a catastrophic failure. And it's clear that Western policy in Ukraine and in Northern Eurasia, as we now should probably call it, has been a catastrophic failure. What are the connections? Well, other states are observing how these conflicts are developing, and they're, reducing exposure to Western sanctions and, slowly de-dollarizing. It'll be many, many years. Also, they're trying, like Georgia, trying to avoid being trapped by this logic of geopolitical conflict, which is Cold War, which is an attempt for the US to maintain and its allies to maintain the dominance. And of course, there's also a connection between the two because so much focus today on the terrible developments in West Asia has led to the decentering of the Ukrainian war, much to the displeasure of the leadership in Kiev today, because clearly it puts this whole, it puts Western strategy even more under the spotlight. That one catastrophic mistake over Ukraine to lead to this monstrous war is one thing, but then of course of course there's deep indigenous roots to both conflicts and in the Middle East, so one can't simply externalize and say, well, we know to blame. But quite clearly, the United States tried to exploit the achievement and the dominance of Israel with the Abraham Accords and so on. That was not a pathway to peace. One way or another, we needed much more political courage to solve and resolve the Palestinian question, right from the start, all the way back since 1948, 47, of course.
Right.
So that's the connections are, and of course you could add a third one. Maybe we'll go there in a minute. Of course, East Asia and Taiwan, and the way that the United States is provoking effectively for example, Taiwan has invested $200 billion in China, in mainland China. So they're just an example of the extraordinary amount of economic interconnection between these two countries. Yet the United States has been mischief making there. And, the visit of Nancy Pelosi a couple of years back and this endless hyping and encouraging of talk of independence. That is simply a red line for the Beijing authorities. Anything short of that, autonomy, do what you like, economy, but there's still a goodwill there, even because the two countries competed together, not as a single team, but at the Paris Olympics just earlier this summer. And there's all sorts of exchanges. I just mentioned economic one between these two, and yet the West is effectively Washington is stirring and whipping up and trying to turn it into another Ukraine, which is again would be catastrophic for all of us, because of course China is the manufacturer. How can I put it? How do they put it? The forge for manufacturers for the rest of the world, the workshop of the world, as United Kingdom used to be in the 19th century.
Absolutely. I I myself would have never underestimated, I thought, prior to this, what I regard, and I'm saying this in my capacity as a lawyer, as a blatant genocide, a flagrant violation of the Genocide Convention of 1948 by Israel in Gaza, and now extending even into the West Bank. And I wouldn't have ever thought that I would have underestimated the capacity of Western governments and their allies and proxies for extreme violence. But even I'm shocked. I've been shocked every day of this genocide at the audacity, not only the severity of the violence, but the audacity of the violence. And I've tried to sort of come to grips with that. Why? Maybe it was always this way, and I just hadn't seen it in all of its, gory color. Maybe this is the first time we've been given, direct live images into the realities of Western government violence. But I also tend to think that what is happening here is that the West regards what is happening in West Asia today as kind of the last stand of Western hegemony. They sense defeat as imminent in Ukraine, the rise of China and India in the Indo-Pacific region, which you just talked about. They still tend to have a dominant position in West Asia. It obviously is very important because of its fossil fuel resources and because of its strategic trade routes, the Suez Canal and so forth. Do you think that helps to account for the severity, the audacity of this violence that we're witnessing, that the West is kind of in a desperate last gasp attempt to maintain global hegemony in West Asia?
Yeah. Me too. In all of these months since 7th of October, one is just astonished by these. Of course, we condemn unequivocally the events of 7th of October, but always, any response should be proportionate and humane and observe the rules of war. Daily one is just, as you say, the audacity, the monstrosity, the monstrous nature. In the West Bank now, I think nearly 800 have been killed, the innocents and villagers razed, bulldozed since the 7th of October last year. So it just goes on. But as you say, it has exposed the Western double standards, the systemic character of Western double standards, that when an awful event, and it has happened in Ukraine and elsewhere, and even individual, the whole media, like a pack turns on it. Yet daily we have this, and yet the BBC, for example, the great BBC, some of the coverage has been excellent, so I have to say that, but some of it has been disgraceful, and it's constantly being bullied and cowed by and don't forget that the Israeli lobby in the United Kingdom effectively led to the defenestration of Jeremy Corbyn, accused of anti-Semitism. Maybe his judgment was perhaps at fault on occasions, but he's not in the slightest anti-Semitic. And as we know by the book by Asa Winstanley called Weaponizing Anti-Semitism, criticism of Israel is not the same as anti-Semitic, an anti-Jewish, or even let alone an anti-religious Judaic statement. And we should be always mindful of this distinction. Can I just say one other thing? That the savagery of the West has been evident since the political West took form after the Second World War. And we know, in a sense, the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Japan was not only the last act of the Second World War, it was the first act of this new age of the political West, where it was going to show its muscle, it was going to show its dominance, and it did so with unparalleled savagery in the war in Vietnam, for example, in which 2 million Vietnamese died. We forget, the United States quite rightly honors its own dead, but we should also remember the unprovoked bombing of Cambodia. Still to this day, children and families are destroyed in Laos. Which was not even a party to the war, that more bombs were dropped on Laos than were dropped in the entirety of the Second World War. Talk about just unparalleled savagery. The Contras in Nicaragua, at an earlier point, the savagery they committed, and it just goes on and on and on, and now culminating. But as you say, in West Asia today, it is now being exposed. And Well, I mean, we can only speculate, and the fact that this sort of militarism has met its match in Ukraine, uh, and of course, even today, after the missiles launched against Iran over the weekend, I mean, Ali Khamenei and of course Pezeshkian, President Masoud Pezeshkian of Iran, have been very moderate in their response. They say enough, so they certainly don't want a war, a wider war. But of course, the savagery and what's going on in Lebanon as well. So
Mhm.
it just goes on and on. And of course, as I say, what really disturbs me is the NATOization of the Far East. That, the catastrophic uh, failures of European security, because NATO was never able to be transformed from a collective defense body, which is quite, as a collective defense body, it made sense in all sorts of ways during the First Cold War. And even some enlargement, but the way it was done is what's at issue here. It never managed to turn itself into a collective security body for all of Europe, and that obviously includes Russia, but all the states in between, Ukraine, Georgia, and others. That's what we really wanted to, but that would have meant displacing the centrality of Washington. And of course, they were never going to accept that. So,
Mhm.
it's, but
Well,
what the back
Washington
of
and
my
U.S.
mind,
military contractors, we should add, because they've profited
absolutely.
fantastically from NATO.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed.
So one of the most striking aspects of these two wars, Richard, I think you'll agree, has been the utter impotence of the United Nations to resolve either of them. And you recently authored an article that was published by Canadian Dimension, and it was titled "The Charter International System is in Deep
Mm.
Crisis." And in your article, you talked about this murky concept that Western governments never tire of invoking. I must have heard Justin Trudeau use the phrase rules-based order on literally hundreds of occasions. Richard, I'm not exaggerating. The man can't talk about foreign policy without saying that phrase. And yet, they never really tell us what it means. Now, in your opinion, what is the rules-based order,
Mm.
and how has it harmed the post-World War II order that was intended to be established by the signing of the United Nations Charter?
Indeed, the RBIO, as some people call it, rules-based international order, is basically a synonym to say we can do what we like. We make up the rules when we will and ignore the existing rules when we don't wish to apply them. So that, in sum, is what it's all about. Uh, uh, and of course, in part, that's a result of the end of the First Cold War, without, the end of the Soviet Union, the end of an external force that was keeping the political West within bounds, even though it failed in Vietnam and elsewhere. But nevertheless, there was an external constraint. After 1989, the political West radicalized enormously, and they'd always chafed at the restraints and limitations of the multilateralism embedded in the Charter, International System, United Nations, and indeed its agencies. Just incidentally on that, the fact that Israel goes out of its way to destroy United Nations installations in southern Lebanon. We saw that just recently. Deliberately goes out of its way and it bombs and destroys UNRWA's, the Works Relief Organization in Gaza. Shows, that the United Nations and a system which it represents, they really don't like it because it represents an external, well, it represents the best hope of humanity and the best aspirations of humanity at the end of the Second World War, the most terrible war that humanity has ever had. Yep. So I'm a great, as you say, I'm a great believer in that we have to go back to the Charter and the principles which it represents. It's not perfect by any means, and of course, the fact that the five permanent members of the Security Council today don't include India, for example, and includes two had-been powers, France and the United Kingdom, who really, by any standard, don't deserve to be members of it anymore. And of course, India should be, and Brazil, and of course, a couple of representatives from Africa. That's the way it should go. We've got nothing to offer. All we do is amplify and echo US talking points, as they say. But unfortunately, the United Nations and the Charter system is in a total impasse because of this bloc. And more than that, the United States and its allies, the political West, after the end of the Cold War, basically tries to substitute for the Charter and the United Nations. It says we are the ones who are making the rules. And they've tried to escape from the constraints exercised by the genuine multilateralism of the Charter system. On the other hand, there's 200 odd states in the world, 193 in the United Nations, and they're saying, hang on, guys, there's 50 odd states in the political West with its allies and so on. And all the rest are saying, no, the state system has matured. The age of colonialism is over. We now have these states, and none of them wants to be, a completely subaltern by the West, the political West. We want to move on. And that's what the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, and so many other regional organizations, ASEAN, are saying. This world, this vision of international politics, which is represented by the United States and its allies, it's so anachronistic, especially when the world is facing climate change, it's facing underdevelopment, at a time when the technological developments, which I'm a great believer in, we're talking now about a phenomenal machine, and you can sit in Canada and I'm sitting in England, and we can talk in such a way. It's magnificent. But this is just a symbolic of what humanity can do at its best across Africa, communications, and so on. Why? So this is why this agenda, which is embedded in the heart of the UN Charter for peace and development, is absolutely essential to go back to the Charter principles, to that spirit of 1945, and understand this terrible malign logic of Cold War, which poisons absolutely everything. And today, of course, has moved into hot wars, as we've mentioned.
I've always thought, Richard, that I too have always been a big fan of the United Nations, but it seems to me that a fatal flaw in the structure of the organization has been the veto power of the permanent members. And even if we were to add India, which certainly, if you're going to have permanent members, and they are going to be, the largest and most influential states, certainly it would be sensible to add India. Probably doesn't make a lot of sense to have all three of the United States, Britain, and France in that group. But I think the real solution, in an ideal world, and I don't harbor any illusions that this is likely to happen anytime sooner in my lifetime, is that the United Nations General Assembly should be given the power to enforce international law. And also, there should be some reasonable system of weighted voting in the UN General Assembly, because it's quite ridiculous that the Marshall Islands has the same voting weight as China, for example. And if we had a reasonable system of weighted voting and the power to enforce through the General Assembly, that maybe, just maybe, the United Nations would become an effective guardian of international law. Putting aside the question of whether that's practically achievable, do you think that that might be a solution to the impotence of the United Nations?
Yes, there are mechanisms for the United Nations General Assembly to exercise greater authority. That wouldn't have the power which the Security Council does have, but nevertheless to do it, to push, but yet even to get consensus on that has been so difficult. And even worse than that, the Western powers have privatized the UN Secretariat. And they're dominating, and they don't allow, for the last 3 or 4 years, obviously they've chased Russia out from all of its positions, including Human Rights Council and so on, and they've blocked China from taking over the headships of, the United Nations is about 22 odd specialized agencies, and they've blocked China from doing that. So it's not just paralyzed; it's a conscious policy of the political West to ensure that it maintains its dominance. And one of the instruments of its dominance is the United Nations. So the United Nations becomes an instrument of Cold War rather than ability to resolve it. Again, we constantly come back to this extraordinary ideology of the political West, which is all dressed up in fancy words. Yet, as we've already stated, the gulf between its proclaimed declarations of international law and human rights and so on, and the actual effect is just so glaring that, are we going to come to a crunch point? It maybe after the Ukraine war, humanity will come to a crunch point, but some people are arguing that it may be best to start again, to abandon this old United Nations and the old charter system. But I'm very much opposed to that. That there has to be internal evolution along the lines you suggest. And there's, of course, we've been talking about it for many years, and it
Right.
hasn't gone, as you're well aware.
Right.
But what I'm saying is, don't ditch this until we really have something better elsewhere. If we ditch this, we may end up with nothing, and that really would be catastrophic.
And my last question to you, Richard, is somewhat of a personal nature. You live in the United Kingdom. You're an academic there. You have articulated courageously and eloquently a position on the Ukraine war in Russia, which is dramatically different from what you hear in the, again, mainstream narrative in the United Kingdom. From where I stand, I was raised in a Greek household, and we were never taught to feel hostility towards the Russian people. We don't view the Russian people as being any more or less of our brethren than we view other Europeans. That's kind of the nature of Greek culture and society, even today. But from my perspective in the United Kingdom, there is an utterly irrational hostility at the level of the elite, the media elites, the political elite towards Russia. And I can imagine that it's rather difficult for someone living in the United Kingdom, such as yourself, to say the things that you say and to articulate these points of view. Could you conclude by commenting on the sort of challenges that you confront living in the United Kingdom? And if you could sort of enlighten people like me, why is there this intense irrational hostility towards Russia amongst the elite, the economic and political elite and the media elites in the United Kingdom?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. That the political culture is very much Russophobic. Some people put it down to, traditional Russophobia going back to the 19th century, because the Ukraine war today, in a sense, is the continuation of the Polish uprising of 1830, 1831, which poisoned, lots of Polish emigres came to England, came to the United Kingdom, and, kept saying what, the monstrous nature of the Russian Empire. And then, of course, the Jewish emigration from the 1880s, 90s, in particular, 2000s, and again, running away from the pogroms and all the rest. So, and of course, then the geopolitical contestation over the great game over Afghanistan and Central Asia, as the Indian Empire was allegedly threatened by the expansion of the Russian Empire. So there's all of that. Yet, at times we've been allies. We were allies in the First World War, allies in the Second World War, and of course there's such like one of the. And you say, as for me, yes, it's tough. I get abuse. In fact, I just got one the other day. A very close friend really shocked me. Her, brutal. Talked about, which a phrase I detest, Putin's useful idiots, which is really, it shows the absence of thought at all. It just simply is a term of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
I get my share, but overwhelmingly, I get so many supportive messages within England, and there's so many people here. In fact, yesterday, for example, we had a service in Canterbury Cathedral, Evensong, classic, but it was associated. It was with United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So we had the UN banner and marched. It was in the choir of the cathedral, and it was very moving. And the head of the Canterbury City Council, Alan Boulder, made a very good speech talking about peace and development. So there's so many good people, and in fact, even to this day, in the British Ministry of Defence and the Foreign Commonwealth Office, I won't give any names, but until recently, I was invited to participate in the Diplomatic Academy here, the Royal Defence College, and so on, to speak. And maybe this will ruin my credibility from the other side entirely. I was invited to address the Five Eyes, a meeting last year.
I'm astonished. I'm absolutely astonished.
Indeed.
They
And what
invited
was
you. Wow.
fascinating at the end of it was that the American delegation, we're smart people and we're big, 6'6" type people. And at the end, we all gathered together against me, on a smaller side. And yet we had because even within, those people who think really understand the dead end which the West itself. So there are thinking people, even in the heart of the establishment, who say, and again, other names in the former the former Conservative administration. Well, maybe just give one name, it's no secret, I think. Um, uh, Alan Duncan, a junior minister in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, who had many years of experience working in Russia, and even he, was always a sort of not Russophobe, not a Russophile, just a balanced, good analysis. And of course, all of that they were all sacked by that failed the buffoonish Boris Johnson, of course,
Right.
and of course the extraordinary Liz Truss episode of our time. So the fact is that I keep going because there's so many people of goodwill who do understand this, who actually do support me, and that sort of gives courage. As I said, the United Nations meeting last week, I gave a talk to the United Nations Association for a big meeting in Harpenden in Hertfordshire, and maybe 40 or 50 odd people, not in the first flush of youth, one has to say, most of them. And the United Nations Association is an aging body. But funnily enough, but it was a really good discussion, because I'm a great believer in dialogue. I mean, you mentioned I'm still associated with those universities in Russia. It doesn't say that I endorse the policies of the government or oppose them. It just shows I believe in dialogue. And as long as we can keep talking, there's hope.
Here, here. Couldn't agree more. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you today, Richard, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to continue our conversation in the future.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it very much myself. Thank you.
And this is Dimitri Lascaris on Reason to Resist, coming to you on October 28th from Montreal, Quebec.